I'm tempted to call Mimi forward to give us the word this morning. Mimi, are you ready? No. Maybe because I feel like I'm in a little trouble this morning, and I started my sermon, you know you're in trouble when your sermon editor looks at you and says, I haven't a clue what you're trying to say. Thanks, Tom. Admittedly, it was a gamble when I chose the text from Romans. There is so much happening in this short verse, with words seemingly wrapping around themselves, with ideas and concepts that we don't often talk about from the pulpit, the law and the righteousness that comes from faith, and ascending into heaven and descending into the abyss, and justifications and confessions and distinctions. How did you ever keep up? Perhaps it's best to begin with what Paul understands as the law from Moses. What first comes to mind is the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other God before me. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not kill. But the problem with the Ten Commandments is as simple as they seem. They are more complex in practice. After all, what does it mean, thou shalt not kill? What about in self-defense? What about in battle? What about capital punishment? What does it mean, thou shalt not steal? What if it's just borrowing something somewhat indefinitely? What if it's taking water from under someone else's land? What if it's consuming energy with no regard for the future? Thus, the law quickly expands into the rest of the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers as case law, how we live this law in practice. And then you add all the laws to maintain one's purity, or it would be better to say to separate oneself from the impurities of the world, the dirt and the decay. There was a purpose to all of this. It wasn't a test where God gets to say, gotcha. It was to help mark them as a people, to set them apart, to make them unique. Yet it wasn't to glorify them as a people, but to make them a light unto the nations. In some ways, it was to help them understand who they were as the people of God, so that knowing who they were, they could stop. They could rest and observe the Sabbath. And in that stillness, in that freedom from finding themselves, they could encounter God. A few weeks ago, I made reference to a little-known rite of passage in the Amish community where young men and women are allowed to experience the world before embracing the strictures, the laws of this community of faith. I suspect an advantage of that structured community is knowing one's place, one's role within the community. Not always having to find oneself, not always having to make a place for oneself, not always having to justify oneself. Surely create space with the faithful, within the faithful, to be conscious of other and greater things, of God even. Surely one of the reasons men and women had gone into Catholic orders over the centuries is to create space within themselves to seek God. The problem for Paul is that the purpose of the law, that intention of creating space in which we can be conscious of God, a space in which God is accessible, God with us. The problem is that the law became a law unto itself. Please note, Paul considered himself a Jew among Jews, indeed a Pharisee among Pharisees. It is likely that he continued to observe the law even though he traveled with and among Gentiles. The trouble was not with the law itself, but the manner in which the law was being used. The law, like any other law, could be distorted. Rather than creating space in which God can dwell, the law began to be used over time as a means to take away that space, to make God less accessible, granting access to the faithful alone, lifting up some believers over others. Unfortunately, even we as Christians have learned to make a law out of grace. Some of you may remember when I spoke at Charlie Shook's class about being an evangelical Christian while I was in high school and college. Though my parents were not evangelicals, nor any of my siblings, my family was deeply involved in our home church in West St. Paul Park in Minnesota. Nevertheless, I went with what I considered the extra mile, hoping that through the power of prayer, service, and faithful living, I would be transformed through the renewing of my mind. I was good. I was very good. I read the Bible and prayed daily. I didn't smoke or drink or swear. I didn't listen to rock and roll. Of course, whenever Pastor Gill mentions a rock and roll classic from the 60s or 70s, I haven't got a clue. And Tom might add that I don't have much a clue about the 80s or the 90s either. I was a straight A student. And apart from giving my dad a hard time, I honored my mother and father. Some of that music from my youth still comes to mind from time to time, such as the lyrics from the late Keith Green song, Asleep in the Light. The song is addressed to the church, to so-called believers who do not show any apparent enthusiasm for the grace of God. The church is not proclaiming Jesus enough, as Paul seems to suggest in the passage we heard from Romans. Instead, Keith Green sings, the church has grown numb, fallen asleep at the wheel, forsaken its responsibilities to be the witnesses of good news. Do you see all the people sinking down? Don't you care? Don't you care? Are you going to let them drown? How can you be so numb, not to care if they've come? You close your eyes and pretend the job's done. Green continues, the world is sleeping in the dark, that the church can't fight because it's asleep in the light. How can you be so dead when you've been so well fed? Jesus rose from the grave and you can't even get out of bed. Oh, Jesus rose from the dead. Come on, get out of your bed.